So my name is Chris Jacobson. I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator here at the Co-op. I'm so excited to welcome 3 out of 4 of our guest speakers this evening. The thought process for developing small-scale food resilience, that's what we're here to talk about tonight, and to have an interactive experience. So the speakers here, we have Susan Hoffman. She is a community herbalist, certified aromatherapist over in Chelsea. She's going to tell you a little bit more about herself as we move on. Karen Gainey is an organic grower, educator, and an active community organizer here in the Upper Valley. Keyword, active,
Keyword.
yes, she's on it.
Has dormancy this
And permaculturist.
Yes, and permaculturist. Yes, the list goes on. I had to clip it for everybody. Tina Barney has been planting a diverse fruit and nut orchard at Murr Meadow Farm in North Heartland over the past 13 years. And a couple years ago, we had a farm tour there to see various stages of the orchard. And joining us, hopefully, in a little bit will be Carol Stedman, and she operates Clay Hill Corners in Heartland, Vermont. You may have seen some of her produce here, as well as her quiche and jams. She has a blueberry orchard that is now maturing, and I'm hoping she'll be here to talk about the road to maturity, which is pretty extensive time frame. So the format will be to allow our speakers to just give us a 5 to 10 minute, here's who I am, and how they came to be, losing my train of thought, how they came to be where they are today in this process of building a sustainable food web in the area. And we're encouraging everyone to explore the thinking that follows everyone's idea. So I'm gonna start with Tina,
Okay.
and I'm gonna actually step aside.
So fortunately, looking around the room, I guess I am not the only one who was alive and aware at the first Earth Day. So I've been thinking about sustainability for a really long time, but I didn't get to do a lot with it until I moved to a property that had a lot of open land with a lot of sun exposure, and it was basically pretty unimproved pasture. It was really boring. The road noise came right up to our house. We could see neighbors on all sides, and it was like, I'm going to plant something here. And if I'm going to plant something and take care of it, I'd really like to be able to eat something from it. And then I went to the Vermont Winter Conference of NOFA and heard Bill McKentley talking really encouragingly about planting fruit trees, planting nut trees, planting shrubs, planting berry plants, planting just about everything, some of which I'd never heard of. And I thought, wow, this is pretty cool. Somebody's encouraging me. Nobody's saying don't do it. And then I started learning that there are a lot of things that people aren't growing that can grow here, that will produce fruit, that will produce nuts. I never knew that. I never knew anybody with an active nut tree that they were harvesting nuts from, so I really didn't know what was possible. The more I looked, the more I found there were varieties that could grow. They're not always going to grow. They're not going to grow for everybody who's in the room, depending what your particular microclimates are, but you may be amazed at all the things you will be able to grow. And I wanted to be able, as I started thinking about this relatively huge amount of land to fill in, I wanted to try to work smarter, not harder. And I didn't want to have to be bringing in a lot of things from outside the farm. I didn't want to be tied into chemical cycles. I didn't want to be tied into fertilizers that were produced commercially. Part of the reason we moved to the property was because we had horses, so I figured, okay, those horses are going to be producing manure, which we're going to compost, and that has been the major source of fertility on the property. And then I started realizing, a little bit analogous to now what people sort of offhandedly say, oh, there's an app for that. Well, if you think about it, forests have been growing for a really long time. So when I think about fertilizer, there's a plant for that. When I think about getting minerals up from the soil, there's a plant for that. When I think of bugs that are bothering my plants, there's another bug that's going to eat that plant. There's another bird that might eat that plant. There are some birds and insects that are going to do my pollination for me, at least on everything except pothos, or things that are wind pollinated. So getting into the idea that I was going to work with nature, I was going to try to learn more about the systems that were doing this in natural forests, and learn to be able to do it so I do all the work up front, and hopefully by the time I'm retired, I'm not going to have to be digging more trees, I'm not going to have to be digging annual crops. I want to be able to have trees that kind of take care of themselves with a food web that helps meet their needs. It's also going to help preserve my spine and my wrists, so that was a good thing, figuring that the older I get, the less I want to be doing other than harvesting. I'm willing to reach up much more than I'm willing to dig down. I also wanted to be preserving soil structure, and that was going to mean do the preparation, let the nutrients come in from the top and slowly degrade, and then I'm not going to have to do tillage, I'm not going to have to get equipment that I've got to have to maintain. So the more I looked into it, the more I started realizing, okay, I'm just going to plant everything that I can think of that possibly is supposed to grow here. I'll see which ones I like, I'll see which ones can grow in my soil, in my microclimate, and it's been a wonderful adventure. I decided to make it solar powered, so we worked with the state of Vermont and the tax credits for getting solar panels. That now is going to provide the electricity to run my walk-in cooler, to run the vents and the fans in my greenhouse, so that I really want to be as sustainably producing things as possible. We dug a pond so that we have that for water security, and the more I started to think about it, it's like, okay, even with climate change, some of these crops are going to do okay, hopefully in any given year. So I've got a lot of different crops, a few of each one, so there aren't monoculture chances for bugs to really get out of hand. Hopefully that means that any given climate, whether it's a really wet year, that's going to favor plants that can tolerate that. If it's a really dry year, I'll have some plants that can manage that, if all goes well. I want to be selling for local market. I really was sensitive to not wanting to have a lot of transportation dollars, and that allows me to stay small and not be tempted to, well, but if I put in more crops, then I could, justify some bigger operation or some bigger equipment. It's like, no, I have to remember to think to keep it simple, to keep it manageable. And I was also helped in doing that by the Holistic Management Farm Plan. And there was a course that University of Vermont had sponsored that I was able to be in, and that helps you set the goal first and look at all your resources, look at how you want things to operate, so you get an overall idea, and then you test any new project that you're thinking about against the goals that you set when you weren't tempted by fancy catalogs or by, spring fever or anything else. And if it meets your goals, then you move on to do that. If it doesn't meet your goals, you say, you know what, interesting idea, but not going to spend my time on it. So I also happen to love fruit. I was sick of having the experience where I'd buy fruit that had been trucked in, it had been selected for transportability rather than flavor, and I'd spend the money on the fruit and then I'd eat it, and I was like, this isn't what fruit's supposed to taste like. And then I started getting my own trees bearing. It's like, yes, this is it. Okay, I'll stop there.
Awesome. Well, my name is Karen Gainey, and I just feel so honored to be sitting up here with two people, and I would include Carol in this too, that I really consider to be my mentors in this journey of learning how to grow food, and it's true. And and I think I come from a similar angle that Tina does around growing food for sustainability, and really wanting to have a lifestyle that is localized for the purpose of decreasing carbon inputs and my own ecological footprint, but also because I believe that when we eat food that's locally grown, and even in some situations more native, that we're taking in the nutrients and the minerals that are in our biosphere, and so it adds another level of nutrition and health. So my journey kind of started out when I was in college and I was living in the Pacific Northwest, and I had this amazing opportunity to be going to school in a pretty progressive place where we had a 5-acre permaculture garden, and I had classes like human ecology and learning about kind of systems in nature and human systems and how they relate to each other. And I've applied that knowledge in a lot of social organizing that I've done around issues of genetically engineered foods to, designing or helping to design sustainable systems and growing. So I did an anti-globalization stuff. So for a while I was kind of active in an area where I was saying no to a lot of things and very kind of learning about a lot of the problems that we are faced when we have this like globalized network of that's based in consumerism. And in 2006 I moved to Vermont and really made a conscious effort to want to get more grounded and connected to land and skills that were based in growing food. So I started working on a farm that was a horse-powered farm, and it was a CSA. And I found that the way that they were growing food there was so incredible because it was so in touch with the natural rhythms, and it's so needed to kind of be taught about. So I found that I kind of went in this path of education, trying to create opportunities for people to learn about things like succession planting and cover crops and using composting and no-till systems. So I ended up doing more education and eventually landing on this farm that was it's a permaculture farm called D Acres in Dorchester, New Hampshire, where I really got into learning more about permaculture as a way of not only growing food, but also thinking in a framework that felt a lot more natural. And it's a lot of different things, and I don't think it's necessarily a new way of growing or thinking about things. I think it's kind of this ancient wisdom that some people like Bill Mollison and David Holmgren put into a framework that made it really more accessible for people. So when I started kind of delving into what permaculture looks like, I was mostly inspired by some of the principles that connect there's 3 basic ethics: earth care, people care, and fair share. So because I find that when we talk about creating food systems that can feed people, it's not just a problem of like production, but of course distribution. And I think a lot of us know this. But in order to create solutions, we need to be looking at the whole. So there's 3 principles, and then there's 3 ethics and then 12 principles that are basically like guiding forces that help in the process of making decisions. So here we are as gardeners, and we have potentially a little bit of land or a back porch, and how do we make decisions that create sustainable systems or food or herbs or medicine for ourselves. So those principles can guide that action that relates to working with nature. And I can talk more about those, but just briefly, one of them is designing in a way that mimics nature. So we learn about how, and as Tina had mentioned, in the natural world, or you look into a forest ecosystem, there's 0 waste. Like everything is getting recycled and utilized. So all the leaf matter is building the soil, creating organic matter, just feeding the roots. And so there's these systems that are kind of inherently connected. So how do we mimic our growing systems in our backyard to mimic those systems that we see in, for instance, like a forest ecology? And to echo what Tina said, which I totally agree with, in permaculture, that's when we think, what are those inputs? Well, we have to put fertilizer in, or we have pests. There's a plant that can do everything for that. And so there's some incredible people that have put a lot of this knowledge into books and have made those books really accessible. So there's certain things that are like called dynamic accumulators that have maybe longer tap roots, and they're able to draw some of the minerals in the subsoils up to the surface plants. And so that is, so what permaculture is doing, and what even, ecological gardening is maximizing those connections, so that so we don't have to have inputs, but we're just kind of trying to mimic and really stewarding the process that is already occurring in nature, and being a little bit more intentional about where we're putting things and how we're placing them and why. So there's a very kind of conscious effort to be creating mulch, to be building soil, to be planting things that draw pollinators. And then on top of that, there's this other thing that I just love in permaculture, which kind of sounds like hyper efficiency, which I'm a little bit hesitant to kind of be. I try to be efficient, but to be like, I think that if we overdo it in our efficient systems, we can kind of drive ourselves a little nuts. But needless to say, there's this principle called stacking functions. So we think about, what are we going to put next to this fruit tree and why? And maybe it helps to draw pollinators, because we know that our trees need to be pollinated in the spring. Perhaps it brings minerals to the soil when the leaf matter falls. There's any number of different reasons. Maybe it's medicinal, maybe it's a tea herb. So ideally, I think we would plant any one thing for maybe 4, 5, or like 7 reasons. So I kind of find it fun to be like, how many different ways, or what are all the different things that this plant can do, and take it out of just the human kind of perspective, like, what does this plant do for me, but what is it doing for the ecosystem that it exists in? And I'm just one part of that ecosystem as the grower, or as the steward. So yeah, I think that's a little bit about what I do now. And I help design gardens and think about, from small, 20 by 20 foot plots to, 100-acre property. Like, what, as stewards or as growers, like, it's our responsibility to be really mindful about the resources that we're putting into the system, and how we're so-called managing that system, and how we're mimicking what we see in nature, and using nature as our teacher. Yeah, we could talk more about like the different ways or plants or approaches, further down the road. But it's a little bit about what I do.
She does it so well. I'm Susan Hoffman, and I'm coming from the whole sort of permaculture place in a much different way than probably most people do, because I'm figuring in to that whole picture, where do the medicinal herbs fit into that. And for me, growing my own food has always been, ever since I was a teenager, has been something that I have just loved to do, wanted to do, and have done. So I came from Michigan, where I grew up, and the growing climate in Michigan is much better than here, I have to say. So it's been a real sort of challenge to let go of the whole idea of having a tomato that grows out in the yard. I have to grow my tomatoes pretty much in a hoop house. So there were a lot of adjustments to be made along the way, but my sort of leanings towards herbs came not from, oh, isn't this interesting, although I was always interested in the culinary herbs, of course, as a part of growing food. But I had a pretty severe health problems and challenges when I was quite young, in my 20s. So it started a whole big process for me of learning about natural ways of living versus chemical medicines. I was pregnant with my daughter when I got ill, and so I was not willing to use drugs for that. So it was a big opening to learning about all different things, and of course the first thing was nutrition, and growing food and healthy food and what's organic food and how's it different. That sort of began the whole learning process. But then, of course, herbs very quickly moved into that picture because the healing plants are really our most profound medicine that we have on this planet. So I very, it was love at first sight, really, with the plants and the herbs. It's a road you don't really just casually go down and leave, actually. So combining the gardening of vegetables and fruits with the gardening of herbs for medicine and for food became sort of a natural, organic process for my husband and I and our 2 small children at the time. And what we learned as we grew and as our gardens matured was sort of permaculture from the inside out, because we never knew that word. That sort of was a new concept. But we sort of figured out along the way that perennial food crops and saving water and in the way that you plant, it's sort of a fancy term for common good sense, really. And you're probably, I don't know if you all have gardens or are hoping to, but there really, if you think something through carefully, that's where you end up is at permaculture, really. We had on the piece of property that we own now, which we've been there for about 14 years, when we moved in there, it was a swamp. It is such a wet piece of land, and the first year, I mean, we couldn't even grow a garden. It was a swamp. We had to dig ditches and manage that water, and now you wouldn't even know that it was wet, really, because we sort of moved into the landscape in ways that made it so that it sort of filters down and it waters layers of terracing, and so it has become a real benefit for us from this awful swampy piece of land. Now, as the soil is getting richer over the years, and we never have to worry about a dry year, ever. We've been able to make little sort of water collection places that can feed our greenhouse, and it's been really a blessing, and especially now as we hear the plight of California, and we think, hey, Vermont's got water. That's good. That's good. But my real passion within all of it is learning the value of the local weeds as not only food, which they are really. I have come to learn that by taking in some of those wild plants every day, your whole body and spirit will change. There's something very different about the wild plants, and when you're digging out weeds to put in your spinach patch, the weeds that you're digging out they are more valuable as food than that spinach is. And not that I love spinach and I will always grow it, but just having a little bit of knowledge about those wild plants, not only for their nutritional value, which they are superior by far to anything that you can plant, and they taste amazing, but not only that, they are responsible for bringing so much fertility to the soil. So I leave in every bed of garden that I plant, I will leave specimen weeds, because they are doing an awful lot of jobs, sort of like Karen was saying. There are many things that plant is doing for the spot that it's growing in, and there will be certain plants that, as you're digging around, that just really look good, and you want to leave them. Mm-hmm. So pay attention to that. I mean, it's really important to learn the weeds and nibble on the weeds, and don't be afraid of getting poisonous plants, because there's so few of them. And if you take little bites, you don't know if it's bad. I mean, the kids are nibbling on stuff all the time. They rarely die, so.
And if they do it, it's a great lesson.
No. But I really would like, if you go away with nothing more today from me than just being able to appreciate and learn about the weeds that grow. Most of the medicinal plants that we use in our business and in our home life are the wild growing weeds. They're not herbs that I plant. I do plant lots and lots of herbs, and we have an herbal product business, and we make all kinds of products with many of those herbs that we grow. But most of them are the wild growing plants, and I don't plant them. I let them grow and I harvest them. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you. So many different directions to go in when we're talking about process, because it's just you're looking at the whole picture. So I'm hoping people came with questions. Who came with questions? Prepared.
I have a question.
Excellent.
That just came up about weeds. How do you decipher what the weeds are actually offering in terms of your medicinal qualities?
Well, really, it's learning about them. Like as long as you can get yourself a little ID book so that you know what that plant is in front of you. You can now, especially now with the computer, you can learn so many things, not only about its food value or its value as a mulch even, or something that brings minerals from the deeper parts of the soil. There's like, name it. What do you want it for? And you've got it growing in your yard, whatever it is. So, and they probably have many purposes, that cross over. So,
And most of the guides that are really useful will tell you what related species are, particularly if there's anything even remotely toxic that looks sort of like it. So you can be reasonably confident if you get a good guide, get one that you're comfortable handling, get one and use it enough that you start realizing how it's laid out. And then you can find lots of amazing stuff. In spring, long before we've got any greens growing, we'll have, get some stinging nettle, harvest it with gloves, boil them up, that gets rid of the stingy part, have them for greens. We'll go after the dandelions. So I love the spring part of getting those deep green wild flavors. And initially I wouldn't have known lamb's quarters, but when I was weeding it out, it's like, all of a sudden it's like, wait a minute, this is edible, and it's really good.
I'm glad you mentioned lamb's quarters. I grew up, my mother ate every wild plant she could see, but she called lamb's quarters pigweed, so we never liked it.
Because that's what she called it.
Yeah, and when you start looking at guides, you'll find that different regions of the country call the same thing different names, and that the same name will actually represent very different plants in different parts of the country. So it is always good to check with a guide and check with a picture, and then find how to prepare it safely.
How many people have gardens? How many people are growing this year?
Not yet.
Will be growing this year. You are, because it's a process. So it's in your head already, right? You've got the seeds, you're at the beginning phase. How many people grow fruit? What kinds of fruit?
Right.
I'm sorry?
But we started recently, so we had a small garden with some pears, some apples, some cherries.
They haven't produced yet, but some blueberries we've gotten, some blueberries and raspberries. But it's only the second year.
About pollination and pollinators and things like that. I would like to spend one word about flowers. the use of flowers in the contest of helping pollinators to survive all year long, because
Yeah.
usually plants you plant in your garden or even the fruit trees have a short season.
Right. So some books are actually set up, the more people have been attuned to the need to help native pollinators, there are books that are set up that will show you when things blossom, although you have to correct it a little bit for area. So you pointed out a really important aspect, which is even though we want pollinators there essentially early in the season when our fruit trees need pollinators, they need food, they need nectar, they need pollen all through the year. So ideally, when you look at those charts of flowers, you can find ones and make sure you've got some that are pollen sources and are nectar sources each month of the year. And you'll start to be able to look around. Another way to do it is to take a picture of your primary planted areas every week for one whole growing season. And notice when you have nothing in blossom. And then look at one of those guides to find what could you plant that likely in your area might fill in those blanks essentially in your pollen and nectar calendar. And ideally, particularly if you've got any bee hives, if you're trying to raise bees, you want to make sure you've got something in bloom, or ideally several things in blooms, because different pollinators like different plants or have the mouth parts and the pollen gathering parts that are suited to different lengths of blossoms. So the more diversity you have and the more options you have throughout the year, the more you can cover. If one particular species doesn't do well that year or doesn't like your soil, you've got some other things that are in blossom at that time. So ideally you can sort of look across a year or two later and find that you've got something coming in bloom throughout the year. So we like it for beauty. Designers might do that because that's pleasing, but it's also really good for the pollinators.
In addition to that too, as you think about perennial blooms, you know, there's a lot of culinary herbs that would not harvest, like oregano, and that you know, offer tremendous amounts to the garden. But like Tina was saying, like you want seasonal perennial blossoms, but also at the end of the year, a lot of gardeners, you know, for aesthetic reasons, will cut everything to the ground. But all of those stalks and you know, as much as you can keep is really good, because you know, things will lay their eggs, or they'll live in the stalks of the plants. So we don't want to just create a barren landscape at the end of the season and chop everything down, but really leave things and then clean it up in the spring as things are moving into their next stage of development. So it really is kind of being in tune with you know, all the other systems that are, like the garden is just, you know, one snippet of a picture of everything that's happening in the ecosystem. So that's another thing that, and it's nice because we're all exhausted in the fall anyway, so you don't have to worry about like getting out there like chopping down every little thing.
It's also food, the seed. All of those
Yeah.
those plants have seed for the birds and the wildlife. And in our gardens, we definitely plant flowers for many reasons, for their beauty, and like you were saying, Tina, just, you know, for wanting color at all of the seasons. You know, I'll just look at what needs to happen, but for us, we really are wanting those pollinators, those native pollinators, to always have something to eat, you know, and the birds, all of our native birds, we feed the birds all winter, and, you know, I mean, I know there's a little bit of controversy about that, but it's really a part of the whole web of things that's going on, and being sensitive as a caretaker of the land to all of those creatures that are on the land, and and the things that they're teaching us about, you know, gardening in relation with all of them. So, and the flowers for so many other reasons just provide us with so much joy and beauty.
Yeah.
So, probably have 10 questions, but I have 2 that just came up. So in the spring, when, do you wait until later on in the spring to do any mulching if you're going to, say you're providing your mulching, right? At all, because then you can see what has come up and make the, as opposed to, and then you know. And no,
You
it's
said you
one
were-
question.
2 questions,
Yes.
right.
And the other question is, I'm interested in knowing what fruits, would you please share the different kinds of fruits that you have at your place? I know the list may be long, but that
It is.
But,
So I'll answer the first question first
Okay.
and then touch on the other one.
okay.
So I will mulch if I have areas that seem to be getting weedy, or if I know I need to put some compost down, I'll mulch on top of it, partly so my dog doesn't chew out the compost.
Right.
But also, the more you're adding organic matter, that is eventually going to create
Soil.
a richer soil.
Okay.
When you can start thinking of mulch as nutrient recycling, it doesn't only have to happen in the spring. So sometimes plants like comfrey that will grow abundantly and is a really good deep-rooted system that will get nutrients and minerals into the leaves, you can cut that several times during the summer and use those nice big leaves as mulch. So my goal is eventually never have to weed. If I can throw something over on top of it and cover it and not have to be digging up weeds, then that's a good thing for me.
Right.
So-
And if you then, does it matter, if you're covering, if you're, chop and drop?
Yeah.
Right?
Mhm.
And putting things on top, right?
Mhm.
Does it matter, do you consider the things that are coming up underneath that are starting to?
You mean seeding themselves,
Yes,
like
that- that
self-sowing?
are, it's early in the year and you
Yeah.
have, you
Yeah.
have no idea what is
Yeah.
propagated, right,
Right.
or pollinate, what has come up
Right.
that year and how they've shifted. So when you put the things on top, will that kill out,
Oh, yeah.
right? So
So you have to
better in the
know,
timing.
you have to be aware of where did you plant last year, your calendula, or, the things that are gonna self-sow.
So you
Because they
so you
will,
really,
yeah.
you want to, before
Yeah.
you either chop and drop
Absolutely.
on or bring in anything or remove, you
Yeah.
want to make sure that everything is up enough to be able to be viable or at least identifiable
Yeah.
if it needs to be shifted,
Yeah.
right?
So I
So the-
primarily mulch in areas where I don't want other things growing, like if it's a young tree that I don't want a lot of competition within, at least a foot of its base, I'll let other stuff grow around it because I want their roots to be intermingling with the
Right.
young tree's roots.
Right.
But where you want to have primary access to the water that comes on or to the minerals that are coming in,
Right.
then you mulch to keep a little clear zone. But I don't do a lot of trying to exterminate things. I let all kinds of
Right.
stuff grow because I figured they're growing here, the seed was here, it's in the seed bank.
And
So
it's
it's
nature
got some
balancing itself.
purpose there,
Right.
right. As far as the fruits, apples, although I'm not emphasizing those in sales, Asian pears, European pears, persimmons, pawpaws, sweet cherries, grapes, hardy kiwis, Asian pears, yep, figs, figs in the greenhouse,
I know.
yep,
I
yep,
need to
hardy
talk to you about
figs.
that one.
Plums, apricots, nectarines, pecans, bark nuts, butternuts, heart nuts, almonds, which have not,
Almonds.
most of the nuts have not come in. I did get my first butternuts last year, and hazelberts are a hybrid that grow more in a bush, and those will come in a couple of years of planting, so I've had
Did you
those
say
for a while.
butternuts in
Yes.
the bush?
Butternuts are a treat,
Yeah,
but the
they're-
hazelberts
They're attacked by a disease.
the butternut blight.
Is
Yep.
there a
So
strain that is resistant?
they will sometimes bear for several years before the disease gets them.
Well,
And
mine, I threatened to cut it down because I hadn't borne anything. So the next year I got one
Yeah.
That's telling it.
That was Yep. And there's also a strategy of using a hybrid between a heart nut and a butternut to get what's called a wart nut. And the hope is that that's going to be resistant to the butternut disease.
Oh.
But it's hardier than a Chinese heart or a Japanese heart nut would be in our climate. So we're always on the margin of where some of these things will live. So if you get a lot of fairly mild winters, the first years you've planted things, you may get away with things that somebody else who started planting in one of the really severe winters may not have been able to overwinter them when they were young trees. So I think I hit most of those things. I also have a bunch of currants, Juneberries, Aronia, other berry producing things. Kind of, if you can buy it in the Fedco catalog and it'll say zone 4 or even zone 5, or if you could buy it in St. Lawrence Nursery catalog out of Potsdam. This is his last year for a while before his family may take it over. So if you had any interest in St. Lawrence Nursery catalog, I think you have till April 15th maybe to order from him. Great, really hardy stuff. He lives in zone 3. If he can grow it, it'll most likely grow here.
What's the name of that again?
St. Lawrence Nursery
St.
in
Lawrence
Potsdam, New York.
Is that where you got your pawpaws?
No, he doesn't grow pawpaws. These I got, the ones that are bearing now I got from Neil Peterson when he was still doing Peterson pawpaws. He sold out. He has licensed his particular trademarked brands to certain growers. So I have actually some more on order from a grower out in the Midwest now.
In the Midwest?
Yep. So pawpaws are more native to Appalachia. They're a very deliciously flavorful fruit that is kind of a cross between a mango and a banana. In a weird little way, people talk about it as banana custard. So they take a long time to grow. You have to have a different cultivar to be able to pollinate it. And the insects that would normally pollinate it aren't particularly around here. So I actually hand pollinate the pawpaws. But if you have different cultivars or a neighbor or friend, then you can grab some pollen and get some pawpaws. Go ahead.
I've tried a couple of apple trees. I think one my daughter gave me about 10 years ago, and it's never had one apple on it.
Uh-huh.
And so is there any place you can go to, you know, as far as like nurseries locally that can sort of have a staff person who can really kind of like educate you on, I don't have any horses either, so, by the
With
way.
the apples, you couldn't most
Or
likely have just one.
any of the fruit trees, I guess.
Right. If you're going to start doing research, it's good to get some catalogs
Yeah.
so you can look through. A lot of people
Right.
have taken the time, like St. Lawrence Nursery will have a big grid
Okay.
where they'll look at what's the hardiness, and he'll rate them from extremely hardy, very hardy, good at hardiness, or not very
Sure.
hardy.
Right.
He'll look at, is this one producing fruit that's good for juice or for canning?
Yeah.
Or for fresh eating?
Right.
Is it a variety that you can store and keep
Okay.
for several months if you want things to extend your season?
Mm.
And you can buy fruit that'll keep in a cool area
Okay.
for 3 or 4 months. If you've got a cold cellar or a root cellar,
Yeah.
then you've bought it in the fall, it's local, but you're gonna
Right.
be able to be eating fresh fruit there. So it'll tell you what the characteristics
Okay.
are of the fruit. It'll also tell you what the characteristics are of the tree. Some
Okay.
trees, apple trees, can grow really, really fast and need a lot of pruning and management. Some will be much more containable, so if you're not really wanting to go climb a 30-foot tree, you can
Right.
look at a dwarf or a semi-dwarf variety.
Yeah, yeah,
If you want a particular characteristic of, another fruit, say you want pears for canning, then when you start looking at pear varieties, you want to look
Okay.
at ones for canning. So
Sure.
once you know what you want out of the fruit, then start looking at some of the catalogs that have put together a lot of this data.
Okay.
Miller Nursery got bought out by Stark Brother Nursery,
Yeah.
and Stark Brothers has a really nice chart for what will cross-pollinate.
Hmm.
One of the problems with apple trees is there's a fairly long blossom season, and you need the second pollen source to
Right.
be in blossom at the same time.
Right.
So they kind of classify them often as early, middle, and late.
Mm-hmm.
So I happen to want to have some in each of those times. And it was before I realized I was going to do all this other stuff. So I planted something like 14 apple trees so that I had a few in bloom at each time throughout the season.
Sure.
So if I get lousy weather days and it's really cold at one time of the bloom, I hopefully will have some other varieties that are blooming later that will have more optimal weather for the pollinators to be flying.
Right.
So there are strategies. The more you know of what the plant takes in order to set fruit,
Okay.
the more you can figure out how many other trees you may need, what other varieties you want. With plums, you have to know what category. There are some European plums and Japanese plums, and they won't cross-pollinate. Even if they were in
Okay.
bloom at the same time, they just won't work. So once you pick what you want to be growing, then do some research. It's worth taking the time to go to a bunch of websites, look for a bunch of catalogs, look through some books like Lee Reich, R-A-I-C-H, has some great fruit books. Michael Phillips from over nearby in New Hampshire has written The Holistic Orchard and The Apple Grower. And both of those, if you were really interested in apple, that's a wonderful resource. So the more you get to know, the more you learn that, one, you don't know, and you can't know everything. You'll
Right.
find out more when you make a mistake.
Yeah.
So kind of get used to the idea that you may make a mistake. You may plant something that seemed like a really good idea, and then you realize, ooh, you know, for one reason or another, that's not going to work on your property, or you don't like that particular fruit if you've never had it before. But it's worth making the mistakes, because most of the time you're probably going to get it right if you do some pretty reasonable research. And then certainly there are people you can talk to, like Dave, I'm forgetting his name, Frank maybe, at Elmore Roots. You know, there are definitely people around who, when you talk to them, be prepared to listen for a while.
Right.
I've always found, not specifically for fruit trees, but I've always found that E.C. Brown's nursery.
I was gonna say that
Thetford
too.
is very
Yeah.
knowledgeable and patient.
Sure.
I've been impressed with them.
Okay.
Yeah, they are very, very knowledgeable.
Yeah, and Henderson's too on Route 14 is also starting to bring in things like persimmons and kiwis
And do you have apples too and things like
And
that?
a lot of
Or
apples, yeah.
Plums and the whole,
and plums and
I'm
yeah,
right down the road from me.
yeah.
Why can't I grow a plum from a tree that I love and has good plums? Why can't I plant plums?
Genetic variability.
Even cracking the nut open, why won't, will that work, maybe?
You might get a tree, but its fruit would not look like the fruit you're growing,
Oh,
most likely. It depends if most commercially available fruits that have a named variety are actually a grafted plant.
oh, okay.
So it has a rootstock of one kind, and then it's
Yeah.
grafted,
Yeah.
right. So once you take the fruit of a grafted tree, it's been pollinated by something else, there's been genetic recombination. So if you plant from the seed of that tree, you might get an interesting fruit, but it won't be the same.
We had awful plums, and then
Yeah.
I discovered this great tree, and
Yeah.
I steal the plums from that.
So you
tree.
may
So
want to
graft
get,
it.
right,
Graft
so
it.
to get some scion wood from that and graft it onto
That's more
other
than-
plum trees.
That's more than I can do.
Okay, but you might have a
Can
neighbor
I
that would
take
do
the
it for you?
plum to the garden center and ask them to give me the tree that makes this?
They might be able to do
They might-
that.
You might be
They
able
might know what
to,
it is.
if you
have
ask
to
them
eat it.
when, right, if you ask them when the fruit is fresh,
Right,
they might be able to give you the name, but there are so many varieties and cultivars now that it would be really hard unless it was something really strange, like a strange combination of flesh color and skin color.
Is this a plum that's growing on your property?
No, that's why I have to
Is it-
steal them.
Do it at night.
Well, it's plum,
Or you can
whoever,
graft it, right?
right, but whoever owns that plum tree probably prunes it and probably
no,
tosses
no,
the
no.
prune.
Just abandoned, yeah.
He does not.
Oh, okay. You've already explored the possibility. Okay. One other
It's
thing
a
you might
midnight
think
prune.
of with apples, I think later we were going to get to what would be the 5 plants that we would recommend. Apples would not be one I recommend because they take more maintenance. They are not selected to be grown organically for the most part. So you can do it, but it takes a lot of work. Michael Phillips' book will give you all kinds of things, and he admits he loves to spray his trees.
Right.
I've been to his workshop, he's a great guy, but he really likes spraying trees. I really don't like having to wait for the perfect combination of temperature and lack of wind, and I have time and it's sunny out and I have all the ingredients ready to spray, because most of the times I'm waiting and I keep thinking, well, today the wind's too bad, or today it's too cold, or today it's too hot. So the other trees that I mentioned, most of them do not take sprays. You can do a dormant oil spray for some of them, but a lot of them you don't have to. Pawpaws, you don't have to. So back to the trying to not have to do a lot of extra work as I get older, apple trees are a lot of work and they bear later.
And the plants
So-
take care of the
and-
balancing out of it.
Right, and lots of people are growing apples. You can buy great apples anywhere. If you're gonna plant a tree, my strategy is plant things you really love, because you'll be more likely to take care of them. Plant something you can't easily buy from a local vendor. Or plant something that has some reason that it would not be commercially viable. Something that has little tiny fruits, like currants, are really, really tasty. Pain in the butt to
I thought it was
harvest.
illegal to plant them because of the white pine disease.
That was an old thing. I can speak to Vermont. In Vermont, it is not illegal. They have realized that it is not really the prime source of the pine blister rust for which it was blamed.
Oh.
And there are varieties that will specifically not support that disease organism.
Oh my
So you
gosh.
can be very intentional. You can legally plant ribby species, so gooseberries, currants. You can plant them in Vermont. I won't speak to New Hampshire. I don't know if either of you can. But when they reviewed the science, they realized that that whole ban, and people went through and cut out all their currants, that was really an unnecessary kind of overreaction and jumping from a little bit of science to conclusions that weren't really valid.
Do they know what does support that disease now?
They do, I don't.
Oh, because I know a forester came like a year ago and said, you have this disease, this white pine blister disease, and said currants. But I know there aren't any currants around, but he didn't have any other suggestions.
Yeah, there are
of
some
what
other
it would
ones,
be.
but I don't remember that. I'm sure I've been told and probably have read it at least once. But once I found out I could plant currants, I just went out and planted currants. Okay, should we move into
I think
the-
you should. I think thanks for the lead-in. So recommendations, what you can't do without in this area.
Do you want to jump in? Because I already got my little bit of it in. I have a little
Well,
bit.
I've been on a, just learning a lot over the past couple of years about nut trees, and I think that, they say that, we should have started planting nuts like yesterday. They take a long time to bear, they're a nutrient-dense crop, and like the American chestnut, after, experiencing a lot of blight just last year, they came up with, after 7 years of back crossing and pollinating, of which breeding I don't quite understand. Tina probably knows a little bit more about this, but they just came up with a blight-free resistant American chestnut.
Amazing.
So we started planting those last year, and they're also there's just amazing cultivars and varieties coming out of Cornell and places that are doing a lot of research. So I would say some of the things that Tina mentioned, like bort nuts and heart nuts, and I think that the more if we're talking about food security, which is often my lens and thinking, there's a lot of places where you'll hear of diverse plantings really being resilient through drought situations, or and what contributes to that resiliency. And so bringing that frame into it, I think planting diverse crops, species, and especially things that can contribute to nutrient density. So yeah, nuts, and also trialing. We're so fortunate to have people like Tina and Sylvia DeVos, that have been kind of cultivating on landscapes for 15 years or more with some of these varieties, because now we have a very localized, even as short as 15 years is, we have a tremendous amount of knowledge that is being shared. So pecans, we can grow pine nuts here.
Yeah.
So I would say those things, and then I would also, and figs, I mean, who does, figs and peaches, like where there's microclimates there where some trees in this region and valley are producing incredible amounts and beautifully tasting peaches. And then other things I would say is, you know, like when I think, and what I've learned a lot about, you know, and I'll use this term again, but just ecological design or planting like a forest is, the vertical space of a garden is also very valuable, just like the horizontal space. So maximizing diversity by way of planting, for instance, nut trees that might be the overstory, but then smaller things and shrubs and bushes and vines. So like currants and gooseberries they can tolerate a fair amount of shade and are nutrient dense. So those are things that I would.
Acid loving.
What's that?
Acid loving.
And some are acid loving, yep. And also one variety that it's not that I can't live without it, but that it's like I'd like to see more of it so we understand how it does in this region. But our ground nuts, they're a vine and they have an edible tuber and they're perennial. So I would add that to the list. And then companion plants are like some of the good old like alliums, like chives, or fresh spring green. They do a tremendous amount for the soil and the pollinators. So like that's like chives and then some herbs that Susan knows like a tremendous more about, but are like kind of the can't do without type things that I would recommend.
Let me just add one tweak. With nut trees, and when you're planting other things under them, be very careful if you're planting walnuts or pecans, and potentially walnuts as well, although it's not as strong an effect. Trees, as they grow in the forest, needed to be able to win the competition for light. So some trees, specifically walnuts and that whole family, evolved to be able to produce a chemical that will inhibit the growth of many plants that try to grow near it. So it's a tremendous advantage in the forest. It's a tremendous disadvantage if you spend $30 to plant a plant near that nut tree, that as the nut tree grows and the jubilone chemical comes from its leaves and from its roots and from its bark and starts to kill your expensive planting. So I actually kind of set my nut trees on the margin of my property and my planting, partly because they're going to be really tall and I didn't want the sun to get blocked by the nut trees. So also think about sun when you're planting, but also check out, there are a lot of plants that can grow safely under nut trees and do well. So in addition to the shade consideration, you also want to look when you're researching before you plant a tree, particularly if you don't know that there are a lot of them already on your property. Check out to see if there are any highlights, like what are called allelopathic chemicals, things that the plant produces that will change the plants that can grow around it. And then it doesn't mean you can't grow it, it just means you need to be thoughtful and then select from the group of plants that are known to be able to tolerate that chemical, and those you can plant around it.
I'll just add one thing, sort of a little bit divergent as well. In that same vein of what's happening, what the tree's putting out, there are whole communities. When you see some a forest growing, or even you know, sort of any place that you see plants growing, there's actually a community that's happening there where all the plants are working together, and they have scientific evidence now that shows how they communicate and how if one tree in the forest becomes ill with some blight or something, there's actual chemicals that go out to the neighboring trees in that community that will help them to be more resistant to that disease. It's a fascinating thing. You know, and even the mycelium that's in the soil, it connects pieces of land for miles and miles, thousands of miles, and our planet would not exist without those very intricate webs that connect all of the life. And we, as humans walking on the earth, are very much a piece of that whole thing. And I think if we can, the more that we can remember that we are a piece of this whole incredible thing that is happening around us, and have more respect for it and more awareness, there's so much more that you can do if you're cooperating with what's already happening there. Which is why, the whole commercial farming, just as not even the fact that there's chemicals being used, but just that whole monocropping idea is so misplaced, because there's too many interdependent things that are not happening when you do that. So.
Yeah,
Do you want
that's
to
a
go
really
through
good
your
point.
top 5 before you?
Were you finished?
Yeah.
with your-
Yeah.
Okay, I don't know if I actually could narrow it down to only 5. I'll try. So I'm going to put, for my 5, I'm going to put them all as medicinal / food herbs, nettles being one. Incredible soil conditioner. If any of you are familiar with biodynamic farming, nettles are one of those plants that are used for the preparations for soil health. Comfrey, again, another one of those. Incredible soil builder, wonderful. I mean, I won't even go into the good things about them for, medicinally or for food, but they both have them. Burdock would be another. And if you've not tasted burdock root, I see it for sale here at the co-op oftentimes. Just, if you see it, if you know the plant, dig some up and try it this spring. But if you don't know it, when you see it on the shelf down there, just buy a root, chop it up really small, saute it, put a little tamari in there, a little ginger, a little garlic. It's really delicious, and so many trace minerals in there. Some of the highest mineral plants are your nettles, your comfrey, your burdock.
It's a good time of year for it.
Yes, and in the springtime, all of those spring greens, dandelion will be on my list as well, but all of those spring greens have not only really high nutrient density, but they also have, they are the cleansers, the body cleansers. So if you're going with the rhythm of nature, as humans always have done up until recently, the food sources run out by the end of the winter, and so your very first spring greens are coming upon a time of lean eating for humans. So your body's automatically starting into this process of cleansing and renewing itself. So eating lighter, eating those early spring greens, the dandelion greens and the nettles and dock leaves and comfrey leaves, almost every of the little green plants, the amaranths and lamb's quarters, that would be another one. They are all really, really cleansing foods. And know that when you are eating wild foods, they're really nice as additions to your other food. If you eat a plate of wild greens or a salad full of wild greens like you would a regular salad, you may have some talking back from your guts, because it's a lot more potent food, and it's not meant to be eaten in heaps and mounds. Like we shouldn't be eating in heaps and mounds anyway, but we do. And I've certainly done it. I've eaten my plates of morel mushrooms this big, and it's not a good idea, really. And it's hard to gather that much anyway.
So
but
comfrey, I didn't realize you could eat it.
you can.
How do you fix it?
Well, it's comfrey. It's not one of them that I would use more as a vegetable as much as the others, but it's a wonderful tea. Yeah.
You don't chop the leaves and use them?
I don't.
Oh.
I don't. I mean, the little young ones I'll put in a salad, but not in a
Raw.
big way, raw.
Would you dry it to make the tea? Or?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you can make fresh. Also, the all of these sort of things, the things we consider you have to dry to make tea. All summer long, you can make tea with those fresh, and you can make sun teas and cold water teas. There's lots of really nice ways to.
And powders that you make some incredible.
And
things.
powder them, if you dry them, and powder all those nice spring greens that are so abundant. Chickweed would be on that list. You can dry them when they're so abundant in the spring, and then powder them and have really wonderful powdered supplement, that you can put on the dog's food, put on your food. Yeah, it's another really wonderful way to bring that into your all year. As I look through my kitchen, I realize that I'm eating stuff all winter long that I've gotten from the garden in different ways, from herbs or vegetables but yeah, couldn't be without them.
If I could add in the rest of my 5.
You live?
So one that people haven't mentioned is asparagus, and it's kind of outmoded, but it's really good. It violates one of my rules in that it takes a lot of prep for the ground before you start it. It won't compete well with weeds, and you need to sink it fairly low in the ground. Some people will say like 6 inches below, some people go 8. I've even heard some things say 12 for frost protection. I don't think I would put them down that low. But you need some ground prep, and you can't harvest them for 2 to 3 years depending on the variety you get. But once you have an asparagus bed, I'm so jealous of some of the ones I see because they're weed free. They filled in with asparagus. That's all that's there. It's a beautiful plant. They're wonderful in the spring when I'm craving some new vegetables, so try to remember those. There are some new all-male varieties that produce more of the edible stalks, but I think that may also be part of why they're not filling in. So I'm thinking of going a little bit back more to some of the traditional ones if that plant's still in. Blackberries with erect canes. The blackberries come in at least 2 big categories, some that drape all over and will wind around and will be a pain in the butt, and others that grow pretty tall and straight and may get to be 8 or 9 feet. Blackberries fruit on the 2nd year that they've grown, so you let them grow up 1 year. If you top them off about 5 or 6 feet, then the next spring they'll start to sprout branches. Blackberry blossoms, the bees go nuts over, pollinators really love them. When you're on erect canes, they're pretty easy to harvest if you thin them in the spring to a reasonable distance between so you can reach through. I let them fill in places that I don't need to manage intensively. I think they also tend to keep some critters a little bit away from some of my fruit plants. And I don't have to care for them at all other than pruning them and tipping them. And the next year after they've been bearing, you yank them out and then new ones are coming up. So remember blackberries. They're much easier to grow than raspberries in terms of disease resistant. You can get a lot of blackberry varieties that you're not going to need to worry about, as opposed to raspberries where they sometimes will say, after about 10 or 12 years, you're going to have to wipe out your raspberry patch because it will probably have accumulated viral load and not be producing well.
Do you have a variety that you like?
Pardon me?
Is there a variety that you like of the blackberries?
The one that I have was planted by the person who owned the property before, so I have no idea what it is, but it's one of the easiest to grow and it's really tasty. So I would look around, but think of...
It's just erect, that's the
key. The key I think in management is that they're erect. And peaches, unlike the discussion about the plums and the apples, peaches are usually self-fertile. So if you have a place in your yard or near your house where it's protected from wind, where you have a microclimate that's a little bit warmer, if you grow your own peaches, if you've ever liked the really good peaches and you select one that is Zone 4 hardy, Fedco sells them, and is selected for flavor, I can almost guarantee you'll be delighted with the results.
Wow.
Homegrown peaches are so good. The downside of peaches is they are marginal in our area. They can die for no good reason, even after they've been doing well for 4 or 5 years or more. Sometimes they can live to be 12, 15 years. They may need a moderate amount of pruning, but because they're self-fertile, you can get away with just one. If you love it, you'll probably want to plant at least 2, so if one of them dies, you've still got one, because once you get hooked on your own peaches, you're not going to want to go back. Nectarines are more marginal, so I wouldn't recommend those, but I would recommend you look for mine because I'm hoping I'll get some this year. And with the currants, I don't know if anybody knows clove currants. Is anybody growing those?
Clove?
They're called clove currants.
How's that spelled?
CLOVE, like the
Clove.
little, right. Currant bushes are kind of strange. They've got a very clear aroma to them, and if you brush past them, you will get a whiff of what you'll then know is the currant sort of scent, which isn't bad, but it's strong, and if you first brush against it, and you're just like, what is that thing? But it's actually good. A lot of people have never tasted cloves, but the clove currants actually have a little bit of clove flavor. But more than that, in the spring, they have beautiful yellow blossoms. So rather than plant a forsythia, where you can't eat anything of it, that I know of, maybe the blossoms are edible, you could plant a clove currant in that space and get fruit. And they will fruit usually within 2 to 3 years of when you grow them. Peaches also, if you plant a grafted variety that's suitable to your area and it survives the winter, you will probably get fruit within about 3 years. Plums take longer. Plums are maybe 5 or 6 years. I'm really excited that you would advocate nut trees, because I thought if I tell somebody, I'm going to suggest you plant something and you're not going to get nuts for 10 to 12 to 20 years, or nut pines may not produce pine nuts for like 15 to 25 years. So just saying, those, just so you know.
Once they do, it's exponential.
That's what I'm hoping. All right, we had a question back there.
The way I got my peach tree was that I found a weed growing in my garden and I didn't identify it, so I pulled it up and it was a peach from the compost. And then I was building an addition on the house, so I had to move it. And I put it somewhere else. And then for some reason that wasn't good either. And so I put it in another place. So it's been transplanted twice. It came from the compost pile and it gave me a bowl this big of peaches one year, but then they developed a terrible skin disease. How do you manage to avoid that?
Well, you try to prune out if you see any disease. You try
I'm
to,
sorry, what?
if you see any disease either on the fruit or on the tree, you try to get rid of it as soon as you see it. So the part of doing it more organically is rather than treat the disease, you remove diseased parts if you can. You try to cut back to a healthy part of the tree. If you see a diseased fruit, you don't let them go to the ground. You don't put them in your compost. You bury them or send them to the landfill. I don't usually send things to the landfill, but if it's got a diseased, if it's got a disease, then you may have to remove it. Another problem with cherries is there are a lot of wild cherries around, and cherries can tolerate and hold diseases that will kill fruit and will kill the varieties that have been raised to produce fruit. So things like black knot or brown rot. So you want to also look around your environment, not only the interconnections on the roots, but the wind will blow things. So if you have a lot of wild cherries in your woods or in neighbors' woods, you may want to stay away from trying to grow a cherry tree because you likely have disease in those wild trees, and the wild trees can handle it. But the domestic trees will have a much harder time with some of those, or you have to stay really vigilant, and you may have to consider spraying for some of those if you start to see the disease. So I personally try not to spray those things, but would, remove any diseased fruit. Don't let fruit rot on the tree and then stay there. If it starts to get moldy, then it's seeding spores all over, and then you're going to have a lot more around. So try to keep that part of the tree clean. Try to clean up dead fruit, try to remove dead limbs or diseased limbs.
So I have a Toka plum tree, which last year for the first time had hundreds of baby plums.
Yep.
And they all dropped off.
So trees are often more prolific because we've selected them to do that than is good for them. So sometimes you'll get June drop, where even a tree that's not heavily laden with fruit, all of a sudden you'll see a bunch on the ground. but it only needs to set like 1/10 of the blossoms that are there or less to have plenty fruit crop. So particularly when you have a young tree, you don't want it to be sending out all these nutrients into huge numbers of fruits. So you thin, and one way that I try to think of it is it's a little bit like the leaves are solar collectors and the fruit is your kind of energy drain.
Yeah.
So you want to have enough leaves per fruit, that each fruit is going to have enough energy made, if not by exactly those leaves, because it doesn't
Right.
work that way, but
Right.
proportionately.
Yeah.
You can also thin to a certain distance between fruits, and depending with the species, that may be 4 inches, it may be 6 or 8 inches. You don't want the branches to be bending so low under the weight of the fruit that they're gonna snap. That can happen to peach trees.
Yeah.
Plum trees will bend quite a bit more, but you want to go through and thin them, especially if after June drop, you're noticing that fruits are stacking up. They're gonna be at risk for getting disease where the fruits are joined, and they're gonna be draining too much energy out, and then you may not have enough energy going down to the roots in the winter to keep the tree healthy, and you may get much smaller fruits. So if you thin, you reduce the disease chance of having stuff get moisture caught where molds can grow or bugs can grow. You get larger fruit, and you kind of help the tree marshal its resources.
Thank you.
I have a question that has to do more with management and production. How many acres do you manage? That's another thing. How many?
On scale.
How do you scale? How do you approach that issue of scale?
Um,
And also for if Susan wants to
Right.
respond to that too.
I fenced in 2 areas, kind of as much as I could afford to fence to keep out our huge deer population.
Okay, that was another question I was going to ask about.
And I've tried really hard, and so far I've resisted fencing in anymore.
Mhm.
So I probably have about 3.5 or 4 acres that are fenced. But some of that is also our house yard and
Mhm.
vegetable garden and pond, so not all of that is densely treed.
Mhm.
We have 10 acres. In production, we probably have 1, truly. And we have no fencing. We're bordered on 2 sides by woods, well, 1 1/4 sides, I guess. And we have not had critter problems at all. We try very hard to work with the wildlife too. So it's more a process of really paying attention to that, and if something comes in, a groundhog or weasels or whatever it is, we work very hard to be in communication with them, and we've never had a problem, knock wood. So it does work. It's a little scary to put your eggs all in that basket, but I've never lost a chicken, and we've got foxes that live right in the field, easy to dig under the chicken house, and many examples I could give you. But so yeah, probably a ½ acre.
Could you say a little bit more about your communication with the animals?
How far do I want to stick my neck out?
Way out.
We're already,
We're already in
we're already doing this, so it's okay.
Okay.
Right? I mean,
Yeah. What do I want to say about that? I have always had a pretty strong connection with animals anyway. I love them. I always have loved them. All types of animals, little and big. So I actually do a fair amount of work with farm animals, and a lot with horses and things, not just with medicinal herbs, but in communication with them to figure out, and in the work that I do with herbs, with my people clients and my animal clients, it's always actually about something that's going on with the people some kind of emotional things that animals have things, and it's real, and we can learn to listen to that and hear it, and if you listen and you actually take action towards what you hear, it strengthens that bond. So like anything with your intuition, that is the way you strengthen that bond, is you act on it, and you put all your eggs in that basket, and you will quickly become more and more sensitive to it. And it's a very rich place to go. I encourage anybody who's not played around with that to, you stick your neck out a little. Yep.
Along those lines, I tell my husband that, and I don't know how to preface this or communicate it, but I like to joke around with my husband that I have a psychic connection with our dog.
Mm-hmm.
And he passed on, the dog did 2 months ago. I don't know if it's psychic per se, but I definitely feel like I'm trying to understand his emotions. And he has moments where he wants to communicate something to me.
Mhm.
And I guess I'm sharing that to hear your feedback, because again, I don't know if that's psychic, but it's trying to be really, really cognizant of how he's doing and what I can do to help him.
Well, so the first thing is that the word psychic, we are all humans are psychic. Okay, it's part of what we do. As children, I think in our society here, it's not recognized, it's not talked about, it's not acknowledged. So it largely goes to sleep in many people. But it's there, and it will be awoken with anybody if you start paying attention a little bit and looking for that. And as far as your communication with your dog, we all communicate with our animals, whether we pay attention to the fact that we are or not. We're doing it all the time. I mean, even people who would poo-poo the words, you watch them. They look at their dog over in the corner, and 2 minutes later they get up and let it out. It's part of our lives. There's so much of our lives that is unseen, and if you start to pay attention to those things, you'll quickly see that the world is much bigger than we think it is.
Well, I think part of that comes from, it's presented as something supernatural.
Yeah.
But I don't think that it is supernatural.
It's
It's
not.
just, there are micro expressions, there's there's information, just smells and things that we don't consciously process.
Yes.
But they're there, that we're picking up on some other levels.
Yes, thank you for saying
So,
that, because that is.
I think that can be a barrier sometimes to how people comprehend it.
Sure. It's not a special thing. It's just part of life. And it's happening all the time around us. And we are responding to it. We don't even recognize it, but we are,
I'd take a little bit of a jump from that just to comment that as my plants have grown, and as the diversity of plantings have grown, our bird population has mushroomed. We have huge numbers more birds that I never saw when we first moved in. And that as you're creating, we're sort of talking kind of from the ground up, but also expanding. When you start planting these plants, you're affecting a lot of organisms beyond that level. Birds that are coming in, birds that overwinter, we don't formally feed them, but we have tons of plants that they can feed on. Some of the berries I had planted high bush cranberries because they were supposed to be edible and prolific and they're beautiful. The taste, not so much. But the birds in February, those will have been left. So when it's getting really cold and a lot of other food sources are gone, those berries start to get eaten. If you have a flowering crabapple or a flowering cherry that has fruit that's left there going into winter, the birds come around. We have Bohemian waxwings. They're beautiful. I had never seen them before in Vermont. I understand they're getting more common around here. But it just really, as you're paying attention to the ecosystem, it's a little bit of the, build a forest and they will come. Build a really diverse habitat in your yard. You will get more creatures. And hopefully most of them are ones you want, or at least ones you can like and appreciate.
And all of those are medicinal, by the way.
We have time for one more verbal exchange. Is there anyone that hasn't had a chance to ask a question or speak up?
So you collectively mentioned starting a garden in swamp. I kind of have the opposite problem where I live on a very dry, rocky piece of property with very poor soil. And I have a monoculture, unfortunately, of blackberries. I cannot get rid of them. They take over my herb gardens. And year after year, I'm out there trying to rip them out, cut them down, and I'm scratched, and they're, bloody, and they're just everywhere. And you've all talked a lot about kind of living with the plant community that you have, but what do you do when it's almost like they're invasive at this point? I know that they're not an invasive, but it's.
Well, I can respond.
Karen, I think Karen's the one.
Well, I think there's all kinds of, it can, I don't know how big is the area?
I have 3 acres.
And there are blackberries all over?
Everywhere.
Oh,
yes.
wow.
Wait, are we talking about blackberries or black caps or black raspberries?
Well, I don't know. I have some of the tall canes, like you talked about, but most of it is those scraggly things that go underground.
But the berries,
They're black raspberries. I
they're,
believe.
well, that's a different thing.
Oh, okay.
We were talking about.
They're probably blackberries.
Blackberries, I
That's
do.
probably what they are.
They're delicious. I mean, we get, if my son goes out any given day, he'll come back with a bucket.
Are they
full.
shaped round or are they shaped a little bit long?
They're long.
They're blackberries.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one thought would be start to find people who are doing clearing projects of trees that have not been sprayed with chemicals and get a whole deep layer of chips
Okay.
and start with a small area so it's manageable and pile it really high with mulch and potentially you may have more resources since we're trying to keep it short. Ways that you can get soil building materials and then the top layer be something that the blackberries are not going to particularly toss their seed into and not going to particularly be able to penetrate, and then let it percolate. What we actually did when we dug the pond was we combined it with resurfacing some pastures that had been taken over by invasive rose. And that's got blackberries beat by about a factor of 10 as far as being really nasty. And we basically buried it and mounded it and let those mounds compost. And now I've got wonderful soil that I'm still pulling out of those big mounds that they bulldozed, a combination of topsoil and invasive rose and other stuff, and I just let them sit and covered, and they composted down, and now I've got a lot of really rich stuff. So you might be able to dig parts of it up and bury it. You might be able to find people around who have chippers, who have wood chips that you could add on. You might also want to look into something called hugel culture or mound culture, where you take those blackberry canes and rather than think of them as just waste, think of them as carbon source that's going to be there, that's going to compost underneath, but you may need to start to build up and essentially create a raised bed. And then keep that where any blackberries that come up, you root them out. But keep it a manageable area or you'll drive yourself nuts.
And make sure they're completely uprooted and the roots can be dry.
Yeah.
But that's basically what I was gonna say too, is smother as much as you can, even if you have old carpet for certain areas, just to cover, to die back, and then continue to put organic material on top of that.
Thank you.
It's a
Lots
lot
of layers
area.
of cardboard.
Yeah,
And wood chips
Start
on
making
top of
pies
that.
and
Okay.
Works
blackberry
great.
sauces.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you for sharing. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.